It's a real pleasure to be back here with so many friends and faces that we've seen over the years. If I might be permitted to share with you just a little behind-the-scenes story, when Elder Delafield invited us some months ago to come and speak to you, he knew that the talk that I was giving around the country was entitled Black Sheep Among the Whites. He also knew that my mother despised that title, and out of courtesy to her, who is a member of your group, he edited the title of my talk this afternoon. Unfortunately, the edited title doesn't really reflect what we're talking about, so with apologies to Elder Arthur and my mother, we'll proceed forward with Black Sheep Among the Whites. It's a very touching experience for me to be here, by the way, also because I understand that I am speaking from the pulpit that was used by Ellen G. White many times when she was addressing a group in this part of the world. You know, as Adventist Christians, we go forth with the words of Jesus ringing in our ears, those familiar words of Matthew 28:19, "Go ye therefore and teach all nations." Yes, teach all nations. But what about teaching our own children? What about our children? Do you think it's really possible for any two Adventists to converse for more than a few minutes before that inevitable question always arises, how are your children? Of course, we care about their careers, who they married, but really, are they in the church? Or have they lost interest? What about our children? How encouraging, how exciting the reports we hear about our church. My, 1 million new believers every 3 years. That means 12 million Seventh-day Adventists by the year 2000, if the Lord should delay his coming. But I wonder, how many of those 12 million will be our own converted children? What about our children? If the future of our church rests with our young people, how optimistic can we be about the future of our church? Doesn't Proverbs 22:6 give us some hope where we read, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it"? What's going wrong? Where have we failed seems to be a litany of broken-hearted parents and grandparents everywhere. Because how can a child brought up in a loving Adventist home, attend church school, academy, college, even our own universities, then go astray? What in the world is going wrong? Should we blame somebody or something? Drugs, television? No, my friends, I don't think that blaming is the answer. You'll remember that there's been only one perfect parent in the history of the universe. And that parent, of course, was God. And yet, even that parent was unsuccessful in keeping all of his family in the fold. In fact, you'll recall that 1/3 of his heavenly children not only went astray, but rose up in open rebellion against him. As imperfect as we are as parents and parent figures, could we really hope to do any better? Our first parents, Adam and Eve, were taught of God and were certainly closest to the divine order. And yet in that family, disagreements arose. And you'll recall the older son rose up and actually slew his brother. I wonder if those parents may have asked themselves, what more could we do? How did we fail? Certainly none of us is perfect. But if God did not keep all of his heavenly family in the fold, perhaps we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves if some of our children choose not to stay. Because isn't that what the plan of salvation is all about, really? Freedom. Freedom to choose, even if it may be the wrong choice. If we look back at the history of our church, we find that those closest to God enjoyed great blessings, but they also suffered great hardships, great disappointments, often related to their own families. Ellen White was certainly neither a saint nor a superwoman. She was an ordinary person, like you, like me. Yet early in life, she was chosen by God to be his messenger. But you know, spiritual gifts don't buy a wraparound insurance policy with heaven against heartaches, tragedy, disappointments, and sorrow. 140 years ago, James and Ellen White began their family in Battle Creek, Michigan. Their first son was their pride and joy, and what a boy he was. You know, parents say they love all their children the same. But as a firstborn, I think I know just a little differently. Henry Nichols White was handsome and talented. He soon became a natural leader. 2 years later, the second son, James Edson, was born. And he was a pain. Oh my, was he ever a pain. He managed to get into mischief and somehow caused grief to his parents most of their lives. A few years later, little Willie was born. Gentle, sweet disposition Willie, the very model of perfection. And then Ellen White learned that she was to be a mother again. Now, we don't know that the Whites were hoping to have a girl, but after 3 boys, what would you be hoping for? In any case, when another little boy was born, we do know that the Whites had not selected a name for him. James White was away traveling for the church, and he would write back home and inquire how little Nameless was getting along. And Ellen White would reply in her letter that little Nameless was fat and thriving, and she had to eat very well indeed to keep him nourished at her breast. But then the family humor turned to tragedy, for in just 12 weeks, the baby boy became very, very sick. And despite the fervent prayers of his parents, he died. Probably the first time he was given a name was when it was chiseled into his little tombstone. John Herbert White. It's hard for us to imagine a greater tragedy than the loss of a little baby. And this by someone who was called to be the servant of the Lord. The Whites had established their family in Battle Creek in a quiet little home on the edge of town, one that they thought would be ideal for raising their children. All of that changed, though, when the state of Michigan acquired the adjoining farmland for a fairground. And around the fairground, they built a racetrack. And the racetrack went right by the Whites' back fence. The Civil War had just begun, and President Abraham Lincoln asked the governor of Michigan to provide 95,000 troops for the Union Army. And these new recruits were camped on the fairground and were trained on the racetrack that went right by the Whites' back fence. How the white boys were fascinated by the sights and sounds of military training. You know, the children of the prophet are very much like any other kids. They're normal kids, subject to the same temptations. And sometimes at night, after they'd been safely tucked into bed, they would quietly slip out, go downtown, and listen to the band music and enjoy the excitement of the war. Before long, they'd made their own toy drum out of a couple of cheese boxes and old sheepskin, and were marching up and down Wood Street with the neighbor boys in a make-believe drill. When poor James White saw his boys so captivated by the war, he was deeply saddened. He knew of the terrible tragedy now in the wounded and the dying in the war between the states. He knew of his own efforts to gain recognition for the new church members as non-combatants. But despite his orders, the fife and drum corps continued with the neighbor boys and his own sons up and down Wood Street in front of their home. One day, coming home from the review, it was just too much for James White. He grabbed the drum, took it out to the woodshed, and chopped it to pieces with his axe. And this made Henry Nichols White absolutely furious. He resolved to run away from home and join the Union Army and become a real drummer boy. James and Ellen White prayed for guidance, and then, in a drastic move, took their boys as far away as possible from the sights and the sounds of the war, all the way back to their home state of Maine, where they left the boys with their friends, the Howlands. And then James and Ellen White returned to Battle Creek to carry on the work of the church. You know, friends may try, but they never care for children like their own. They never love them like their own. And the boys had assigned duties, of course. After school, their work was to assemble the prophetic charts that were used by the evangelists around the country. But in their spare time, they liked to go down to the river and watch the men maneuvering the logs down to the sawmills. One day, Henry fell in. He became chilled, and his parents returned to find him very, very ill. Medicine, you know, was not very effective back in those days, and Henry felt that he just wasn't going to get well. He wrote a letter back to his friends in Battle Creek in which he said, "I appeal to all my young friends to not let the pleasures of the world eclipse the loveliness of the Savior. Remember that the deathbed is a poor place to prepare for the inheritance of a second life. Spend the best of your days in serving the Lord. Farewell." And then again, despite the fervent prayers of the family, they lost their firstborn, their sweet singer, their pride and joy. The parents who had such high hopes for their firstborn were absolutely devastated. It was a terrible calamity. But Henry Nichols White was taken back to Battle Creek and laid to rest beside his little brother. What a disappointment. What a loss. What a terrible, terrible tragedy. Now there were just two white boys left. And how the parents loved those two boys. But those two boys were as different as night and day. Willie, you remember I said, was the younger. He was the angel, the perfect child from the day he was born. It was said that he inherited the very best traits of both his parents. He stood at their right hand all the days of their lives, and he served the Lord and our church all the days of his life. On the other hand, there was James Edson. He was the older, and he was a problem. Oh my, was he ever a problem. He was a problem child. He was a problem teenager. He was a problem adult. He even showed good little Willie how to get into mischief at times. And of course, the boys had too much free time, and I'm sure that after the death of their brothers, they were just a little spoiled. But it was said that Edison thoroughly enjoyed girls, rich food, fancy clothes, and the good life. And he nearly drove his parents crazy most of their lives. Maybe you know someone like that. Somehow he was always long on ideas, but short of funds. His father, who was a good businessman, became so exasperated with him that finally he refused to write to him or even live in the same state with him. And can you believe that at one time, Ellen White considered giving up her ministry because of the activities of her older son, James Edson. To make matters worse, unlike his handsome brothers, nature had not been particularly kind to him. He's described as having a big nose, weak chin, and ears that were absolutely monumental. Somehow he'd managed to inherit the very worst traits of both his parents. As a youth, James Edson White was creative, energetic, resourceful. Some said he even had a spark of genius. But he had another side, a side that was eccentric, stubborn, and unpredictable. His parents really hoped he would go into denominational work. His father even taught him the printing and publishing business. But you know, being in the family of the prophet and living in the goldfish bowl that was church headquarters was not always easy. And James Edson White had other ideas. No, he wanted to go into business. So off he went to seek his fame and fortune. He'd always had a love for water, so he went to work on a Mississippi River steamboat. He became very good at it. And before long, he'd earned his master's license. Then he established his own publishing business. He became interested in the new science of photography and opened one of the very first photographic studios in Battle Creek. He was an inventor. He was an idea man. Why? He invented a fancy folding camp-meeting chair with rockers. He invented a burner for wood stoves that somehow never quite worked. His businesses would grow, they'd expand, and they usually exploded. He made a lot of money, and he lost a lot of money in some of the best and probably worst ideas of the post-Civil War United States. And I'm afraid that the letters home to Mother were not at all encouraging. In one of them he said, "Mother, I'm not at all religiously inclined." My, how those words must have crushed Mother Ellen. Truly, for the family and the church, Edson White was a headache and a heartache. But the letters of appeal from Mother Ellen continued through the years. In fact, some of the most touching letters we have today were those written by Ellen White to her older son. In one of them, she appealed to him not to be pulled under by the undertow of this world. And he promised himself that someday perhaps he would go back into the Lord's work, someday if he ever got out of debt. But of course, that day never came. But then after 40 years, a miracle happened. In a letter to his mother, he wrote, "I have surrendered fully and completely. I have no desire for the amusements and pleasures that made up the sum of my enjoyments before. I want to connect with the work of the cause in some way." Ellen White was overjoyed. Why, she wrote in her diary that for her, the prodigal had returned. But I'm afraid the denominational leaders were underwhelmed, to say the least. They were not quite sure just what to do with him. But James Edson studied and he prayed, and he read Ellen White's stirring call to carry the Advent message to the former slaves in the South. He read that blacks should be taught to read and understand the Bible for themselves, and above all, they should be considered children of God. And Edson resolved that this could be the mission field for him. He had an idea. If somehow he could teach the people to read, they just might study and listen to his message. But how would he get there? How would he travel? Where would he stay? He certainly wouldn't be welcome among the white people, for he'd be viewed as a threat to white supremacy. And then, of course, he couldn't live with the blacks, for he'd be lynched for sure. And then there was that other small matter. He'd had absolutely no training in preaching or teaching. But you'll recall that I told you that he was an idea man. And he remembered his years steamboating on the Mississippi. And he thought that might be the answer for him. Why? He'd have a floating schoolroom, he'd have a chapel, he'd have a place to live, and he'd have means to travel. There was only one problem. He didn't happen to have a riverboat. And he just happened to be broke at the time. And you can rest assured that his sober-minded brethren at the General Conference were not about to give him one thin dime. But he was an idea man, and he figured out how to kill two birds with one stone. He began another shoestring project. He knew the publishing business, and he put together a book with lots of pictures, easy words, and simple sentences. He called it The Gospel Primer. It sold for 25 cents, and he promoted it to every Seventh-day Adventist home in America. In fact, it became the first Seventh-day Adventist book for children. And you know, it sold over 1 million copies. And with the money from this little book, James Edson White began his very own self-supporting missionary enterprise. He began to build his very own paddle wheel river steamboat. But remember what I said, he was a little eccentric. So he didn't choose to build a steamboat on the Mississippi. He didn't even choose to build it on Lake Michigan. No, he began building his steamboat 100 miles inland in Battle Creek, where he found a carpenter who put the frames together in his basement during the winter. Of course, the project before long became so cumbersome that the parts had to be shipped down the Kalamazoo River, where it was assembled on the riverbanks. Of course, the church members all thought he was nuts, and what he was doing was a terrible waste of time and money. But after all, it was his time, and it was his money. So while the criticism severely tried his patience, I'm sure, he kept on working. And gradually the church members became interested. Some donated lumber, others donated hardware. One member even built a boiler to run the thing. And what a boat it was. 72 feet long, 12 feet wide, with a draft of only 2 feet, because it was made to navigate some of the narrow waters of the Mississippi. It had 2 decks with room above for over 200 people to meet, and living quarters for 6 below, plus, of course, a little print shop and a little photographic darkroom. And because this ship was designed to carry the light to a dark place, he proudly named his ship the Morning Star. During the construction of this boat, Edson was invited to speak to the local churches, and how happy he was when one day he finally had his very first convert. 5 months later, they were ready to go. The boat was finished and ready to be towed the 50 miles across Lake Michigan. He arranged with a freight boat to attach 600 feet of cable, and they began their journey. But apparently, weather forecasting back in those days was not as accurate as it should have been, and they chose the worst possible time to make the crossing. A terrible storm blew up on the lake. Little steamer was tossed to and fro in the waves. All through the night, James Edson hung onto the wheel and did the only thing he could, which was pray. The water pounded over the decks and through the doors because, of course, a little steamer was built for the quiet waters of the Mississippi and not this treacherous inland sea. Those of you who are in boating know that the worst possible place to be in a storm is in a big top-heavy boat with a very narrow draft. All through the night, the storm continued. 14 hours later, they reached Chicago. It was morning. The captain of the freight boat that had been towing them said it's something besides human power that's kept that boat. Here's a thank offering, and he handed James Edson White a $10 bill. But I'm afraid that storm was a terrible omen of the misunderstanding and the violence that would befall James Edson White and his Morning Star in bringing the message to black America. But he was ready. This latter-day Don Quixote. But you know, it's only someone with his creative, innovative, stubborn qualities that could have ever carried such an unlikely project through to success. A boat indeed. An ark to carry these innocent visionaries into the very jaws of the Yankee-hating South, where the blacks outnumbered the whites 20-1. He had his little book, the Gospel Primer, which was to be his textbook to teach the people to read and interest them in the Bible. He had his little printing press to print the tracts and handbills to advertise his meetings. And he had his little photographic darkroom where he made magic lantern slides to attract his audience. In short, most of his previous business experience was used in the grand cause of serving the Lord. The boat finally arrived, but it met with frightening opposition. Sometimes they were greeted at the landings with a shotgun blast. One of them nearly took away the wheelhouse. For along with the Advent message, Edson was teaching the blacks to read and to write. And this was viewed correctly as a real threat to white supremacy. But despite this terrifying opposition, there were many, many converts. The families of the slaves were eager to learn, but the new believers were dirt poor. Many of them had no shoes. When they paid their tithes and offerings, they paid them in pennies and nickels and dimes. In desperation, Edson appealed to the General Conference for funds to help keep his churches together. But the church was going through reorganization at the time. I'm afraid there just wasn't very much interest in what was happening in black America. Finally, Edson persuaded his mother to put the pressure on the brethren, and they agreed to take up one Sabbath school offering for the work of the Morning Star. They did, and it came to $11,405, and it was exactly what Edson needed to continue his work. But there was a depression on in the United States at the time, and somehow the funds got spent elsewhere. That happens. Edson was desperate. He had to raise some money. He had to raise a lot of money, and he had to raise it fast. He was an idea man. He did the one thing he knew how to do well. He published another book. He called it The Coming King, and it too was a huge success. It went to 15 editions. Again, publishing over 1 million copies of a religious book. It sold for $1.30. And with these funds, he was able to continue his work in the South. In fact, he began an expansion program that may have not been the wisest expansion program. He expanded the Morning Star in its length by 50 feet. And he changed it from a stern wheeler to a double side wheeler. He even bought a barge to carry along the extra workers who had joined his ministry. And because the barge followed along behind the Morning Star, he called it the Dawn. Somehow, God blessed this eccentric, self-supporting ministry. Because James Edson White established more than 50 churches and schools along the Mississippi. including the first school for blacks in Huntsville, Alabama, which later became Huntsville Oakwood College. He began the first publishing enterprise in the South, which later became the Southern Publishing Association. And the little press from the Morning Star became its first piece of equipment. Finally, he interested the church leaders in the work of the South. And 15 years after Ellen White's first appeal, he found with her the site for Madison College in Nashville, Tennessee. He hoped to continue his work, but the inevitable happened in 1905, and the Morning Star sank. I'm sure it had something to do with that expansion program. You just can't add 50 feet to a ship and expect it to remain the same, Neil. It was refloated, but by this time, the legendary mission ship was infamous. Racism was now so extreme that whites could no longer safely work with blacks. But providentially, God had raised black Seventh-day Adventists to carry the third angel's message to their own people. And so it was, my friends, that this visionary black sheep of the white family, this impulsive, generous-souled, erratic adventurer in the work of God, first carried the Advent message to the blacks in the South. He retired quietly and peacefully and served the Lord the rest of his life, making magic lantern slides for the use of our evangelists. He died at the age of 79, and he left no children, which many thought was just as well. But which I feel is rather sad, because he's the sort of colorful old eccentric genius of which any kid could justifiably be proud. His legacy, of course, a strong force of black workers. For from these small beginnings on the Mississippi, many members of our church today trace their first contacts with the Advent message to the Morning Star and its little churches and schools along the riverbanks, where James Edson White carried the message of hope and opportunity, educational advancement, to the children of slavery. This unpromising son, this trial for the family and for the church, had made an important and innovative contribution to the cause of God. Mother Ellen's patient efforts, patient prayers, had been rewarded. On the other hand, James Edson White had a younger brother, Willie, who was not only good and served the Lord in the church all the days of his life, he had 7 children who were good and served the Lord in the church all the days of their lives. And he had 18 grandchildren. Some of them were good and served the Lord in the church, and some did not. I'll tell you a little bit about one of those. When I was a kid growing up, my dad was a preacher. Most of you know him. He was Arthur White and headed up the White estate at the General Conference. He hoped his son would be a good boy, go into denominational work, possibly the publishing work, even become a preacher at the White estate at the General Conference. But for us, Dad was away from home a lot, the work of the church. There were some discouragements. Sometimes I would hear him in the other room praying and anguishing because he felt that the brethren simply at times were not heeding the words of the spirit of prophecy. And I'm afraid that being in the family of the prophet in the goldfish bowl at his church headquarters wasn't always easy. And I really could see no future for myself in becoming a latter-day Jeremiah living on soybeans. And I'm afraid that my church experience could be summed up in 3 words: boring, boring, boring. No, this James White had other ideas. I wanted to go into business. Growing up as Seventh-day Adventists in Tacoma Park, though, we seemed to have only 3 career choices: preaching, teaching, and doctoring. Somehow there's a premium placed on intelligence, and even among Adventists, rich people seemed more important than poor people. At that time, the Adventists with the biggest homes and the fastest cars and the prettiest wives were doctors. So my career choice wasn't too difficult, except the thought of being around sick people all the time seemed a little bit depressing. So I chose dentistry. The most successful dentists at that time were in California. So you can probably guess in which direction I headed. I worked very hard and I became a successful California dentist. But after a few years of practice at the Stanford Medical Center, we came to realize that the average dental operatory measures 8 by 11 feet and is designed for 3 people. Why, the average prison cell measures 9 by 12 feet and is designed for only 2 people. In short, I felt at times that dentistry was a little confining. No, once again, this James White had bigger ideas. The real excitement, the real opportunities were in developing new projects, new ideas. One of my patients was a Coca-Cola truck driver, and he had an idea for a fast food business. Together, we built a tiny little pizza parlor, which we called Round Table Pizza. We worked very hard and became successful beyond anyone's wildest imagination. At that time, franchising was wide open, and we built round table pizza parlors everywhere. And I can assure you that being president of a pizza company is far more fun than dentistry. With grand opening parades and crowning of Queen Guinevere, and more rewarding too. My, how those dollars rolled in. New words entered our vocabulary, words like Cartier, Dom Perignon, rolls. By the way, Elder Arthur, do you know how long it takes to get used to a rolls? About 10 seconds. Pretty heady stuff for this preacher's kid from Tacoma Park. But now I understand those words, that it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Because in those rather understated words of my great uncle Edson, I was not at all religiously inclined. No, for us in the 60s and the 70s, it was life in the fast lane, fast cars, fast boats, fast friends. Married and divorced a number of times, I decided to remain the playboy of the Western world because aside from IRS, how could things get any better than this? I planned to perhaps creep back to the church on little cat's feet, maybe someday. But can you imagine the despair of my parents? Can you imagine their disappointment at how I chose to use my freedom? Freedom that Christ had died to give me. Freedom to make a choice, even if it was a wrong choice. But you know, we may be far from God, but God is never far from us. Apostle Paul says, in Him we live and move and have our being. God is all around us. And miracles do happen. For me, perhaps in a most unlikely way, 40 years after I left Tacoma Park, a pretty lady who was visiting the big house on the hill asked some questions about those red books in the library by someone named White. And that's how it all began. I found myself in the rather awkward position of trying to explain Seventh-day Adventist beliefs to someone who'd never heard of Seventh-day Adventist. There are a lot of people like that out there, you know. Because the young lady had been reared in a Catholic family, in my usual understated way, I began the story with the mark of the beast. Surprisingly or not, she wanted to learn more than I could ever tell her. And so we attended a Revelation seminar. She wanted to know more. So we attended a conference evangelistic series. Before long, we were regularly attending church, keeping Sabbath, and continuing to study. Together, we read Steps to Christ which was the first book by Ellen White that I'd ever read from cover to cover. But I'll tell you that God's love came through the pages of that book, and it touched our hearts. Just as God's love came through Mother Ellen's letters to her son, James Edson. Well, so much for life in the fast lane. For me, the party was over, but I'm happy to tell you that the pretty lady stayed. We were married 5 years ago at Elmshaven, the last home of Ellen White, and we were baptized 3 years ago on Ellen White's birthday. I'd like you to meet that lady now. Christina, would you stand up for us? How thankful we are that God kept the door open for us just a little longer. What now? Well, like the earlier black sheep who return to the fold, we spend our time studying, visiting churches, schools, and groups such as yours, talking about church history and that wonderful gift of the spirit of prophecy. And just as James Edson White's mission was to black America, perhaps the mission of this James White is to the black sheep of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which just might be what God had in mind for us all along. Will history repeat itself? Time will tell. But with God's help, we'll try. But my friends, what about your children? Wait for them. Sometimes the years have to go by before we gain the wisdom to know what's really important. Wait for them. Only in the evening can we look back on the events of the entire day. And if I were to look back and learn anything from the events that have affected me, I would like to offer one or two observations about our children and their future. First of all, I would urge early career counseling and guidance. You know that text in Proverbs we talked about, training up a child? That text is translated to mean literally, train up a child according to his natural abilities and talents. Because only in this way can he ever find true happiness and fulfillment. And you know, helping our child discover what he is gifted to be and what God's great plan is for him, and then supporting that choice, is our way of affirming them as God's special creatures. And let's keep our priorities straight. I know the 2300-day prophecy is important, but of far greater importance is understanding God's great love for his children. Understanding that Jesus gave his life on the cross for me and would have given it for me if I were the only one to repent and follow him. And let's never forget that God's great plan of salvation is one of choice. It always has been one of choice. Choice for everyone, even our children. Are parents willing to let their children have that choice? Can they accept that decision? Remember, it's only with free, thoughtful, personal choice can anyone ever be truly converted. And again, what about our children? Friends, never stop praying for them. Never stop hoping for them. Never stop believing them. Even though they may have lost interest and detoured from the truth for a time, they may not be with God, but God is surely with them. Remember, in him we live and move and have our being. God is all around us, and that child is part of God's great plan. After all, parenting perhaps is God's way of helping us understand his own heart, what he has to go through with each one of us. Finally, perhaps we can take comfort in the words of Jeremiah found in Jeremiah 31, 16 and 17, Words that were chosen by a broken-hearted father, James White, to comfort those who attended a farewell service for his baby son called Nameless. Jeremiah 31, 16 and 17. Keep your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears, for your work shall be rewarded, says the Lord, and they shall come back from the land of the enemy. There is hope for your future, says the Lord, and your children shall come back to your own country.